April 1942. The sun hung white above Bataan. The jungle shimmered like molten glass. And across that burning road, men began to die. The war in the Philippines was over. For the Japanese, victory had come faster than expected. For the Americans and Filipinos, surrender meant survival. Or so they thought. But what waited on the road north to Camp O'Donnell was something else entirely. Over 60,000 prisoners, American and Filipino, began the march. 60 miles under the sun. No water, no food, no mercy. Eyewitness accounts preserved at the U.S. National Archives describe the scene. Bodies collapsing by the roadside, guards shouting, striking, forcing movement at bayonet point. Heat waves blurred the road until it seemed the air itself was burning. And yet, amid that furnace, something quiet happened. A lieutenant from New Mexico, starving, lips cracked, skin gray, tore half his rice ration in two. He handed it to a man stumbling beside him, a stranger from Kansas. The guards saw it. They stared, confused, almost offended. Because to them, survival meant strength alone. To share was weakness. In Japanese military doctrine, shaped by the Bushido ideal, compassion had no tactical value. The weak were discarded to preserve the strong. It was efficiency, brutal, logical, absolute. But here, on this march, American soldiers did the opposite. They divided their food, their canteens, their strength. They fought not against the enemy, but against despair. A Japanese sergeant, recorded later in an interrogation transcript at Yokohama, confessed his bewilderment. "They gave food to men who would die anyway," he said. "In our army, that is nonsense. But they did it again and again." The guards could not reconcile what they saw. To them, mercy was disorder, pity was weakness. And yet these prisoners, beaten, starving, broken, showed a discipline of a different kind, a moral discipline. The road to San Fernando became a study in contrast. For every cry of command, a whisper of defiance. For every act of cruelty, an act of care. That contradiction, visible in the heat haze, unsettled even the victors. Archival notes from Camp O'Donnell describe the same pattern: shared rations, improvised bandages, men giving up portions to the sick. In the hierarchy of suffering, solidarity became survival. That was the first discovery of the march, that power and humanity could exist in opposite hands. The guards did not understand it yet, but for the prisoners, each shared mouthful of food was a declaration, a quiet refusal to let cruelty define them. The wind rose through the sugar fields, flies gathered on the fallen, and in the distance trucks rumbled north. The march was far from over, but something deeper had begun, an invisible resistance carried in a handful of rice. Dust still clung to their boots when the gates closed. Camp O'Donnell, once a Philippine Army training ground, had become a graveyard. Within weeks, more than 15,000 prisoners would die here. The air smelled of rust and decay. The wells ran dry. Every morning, lines of bodies stretched toward the tree line. According to records at history, Army.mil, American medics, themselves prisoners, treated hundreds with no supplies. They boiled muddy water. They reused bandages until they fell apart in their hands. The Japanese guards looked on, puzzled by the persistence. To the captors, a soldier's worth ended when his weapon fell. To the captured, worth began when everything else was gone. A corporal from the 31st Infantry wrote in his diary, "Men shared their rice, their shoes, their breath, because that was all left to give." That simple act, to split food with another, became a code, unspoken yet understood. In the silence of the camp, it was a way of saying, we are still human. Every day the Japanese routine was exact. Roll call at dawn, forced labor by noon, punishment for infractions, kneeling under the sun for hours. And yet, in the corners of the barracks, something defied that order. One bowl of rice became 3. A guard might look away, thinking it pointless. He did not see the arithmetic of survival, that one man could stand tomorrow because two others gave tonight. Here lies the second discovery. The Japanese guards believed discipline came only from obedience. But in these camps, discipline came from compassion, a new kind of command, not shouted, but lived. At Cabanatuan, north of O'Donnell, the system hardened. This was where the long-term prisoners were kept. Thousands of Americans, many still sick from the march, were pressed into labor. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi spread faster than rumor. Medical officers, captured from the U.S. Army, improvised with anything they could find: coconut shells as cups, scrap tin for surgical tools. A single dose of quinine divided 20 ways. According to the Imperial War Museum's oral archives, Japanese guards occasionally smuggled small favors, cigarettes, bits of bread. Not out of mercy, but curiosity. They could not understand what drove these prisoners to share everything: food, tools, even jokes. To them, war stripped men to their instincts. To these Americans, war revealed something else: a faith in one another that the enemy could not crush. At night, the camp fell into murmurs, stories whispered through the dark, of families, of home, of men lost on the march. Each memory shared became a ration of hope, and hope, intangible, invisible, was the one resource the guards could not confiscate. By July, disease had killed more prisoners than combat ever did, but the spirit that survived among them had changed shape. No longer the soldier's will to win, but the human will to endure. In one interrogation, years later, a Japanese officer described his confusion. They were beaten, but they smiled to each other. I did not know how to fight that. The camps had become laboratories of belief, where cruelty tested its limits and found the human heart outlasted steel. Beyond the fences, the Philippine rain began to fall, soft, endless, indifferent. Inside, men whispered one another's names, promising to remember. They did not know yet. Some would return, others would not. But the idea they carried would survive them all. The monsoon came early that year. Rain turned the camp roads to rivers of mud. Lightning flashed over the barracks, silhouetting men reduced to shadows. By now, Cabanatuan had become the largest Japanese POW camp in the Philippines. More than 8,000 prisoners, most sick, all hungry. Each man received one small bowl of rice per day, sometimes mixed with weevils, sometimes not at all, and still, they shared it. Reports from the U.S. Army Center of Military History describe a quiet system that evolved inside those fences. Food pooling, the guards called it, though they never understood its design. Groups of 5 to 10 men combined their rations, rotating who would eat more that day. The weakest always ate first. It was arithmetic born from starvation, a democracy of hunger. To the guards, this was irrational, a waste of strength, but to the prisoners, it was the only way to keep meaning alive. The third discovery took shape here, that leadership, stripped of rank and uniform, could still survive as empathy. Captain Edwin Dias, who escaped in 1943, later wrote, "Even when a man had nothing left, he gave something. That's how we stayed soldiers." The Japanese camp commanders watched with unease. They enforced discipline through fear. But fear lost power when men stopped thinking only of themselves. A diary from a civilian guard at Cabanatuan, recovered after the war, reveals his astonishment. They bow when ordered, but they never surrender inside. When one is punished, others look away, not in cowardice, but in respect. That invisible unity frightened the guards more than defiance ever could. The prisoners had found strength in sacrifice, a logic the Bushido code could not decode. The psychological divide deepened. Japanese ideology placed the emperor above all. To die for him was the highest honor. But these Americans found honor in endurance, in keeping one another alive to tell the story. The more the guards tightened control, the more cooperation grew among the prisoners. Clandestine medics traded scraps of quinine. Mechanics repaired stolen tools under blankets. Chaplains whispered prayers through bamboo walls. According to IWM oral archives, Japanese officers once tried to divide the men by race, separating Filipino, black, and white prisoners into labor groups. The plan failed within days. Rations flowed across the lines. Names were swapped to protect the sick. Unity became rebellion, silent, unstoppable. In one instance, a guard struck a man for collapsing during roll call. Before he could rise, another stepped forward to take the blow. Then another. Then three more. The sergeant froze, unable to comprehend a defiance that required no violence. That was the fourth discovery. Power could be met not with resistance, but with dignity. As 1944 approached, rumors drifted through the fences. Allies moving north. MacArthur's promise. I shall return. Hope was dangerous now. It invited punishment, but it also became a weapon. Men carved hidden calendars into wood beams. They counted not the days they had lost, but the ones left to hold on. Outside the wire, the Japanese Empire was beginning to fracture, supply lines cut, morale fading. Inside the camp, the opposite happened. Where cruelty was meant to break them, it forged them instead. The guards saw it and feared what it meant. Because if prisoners could find strength in mercy, what did that say about those who lived by cruelty? The rains eased, the stars returned, and in the silence between patrols, a murmur spread through the barracks. MacArthur was coming. The night was moonless. Only the cicadas spoke. Beyond the barbed wire, the jungle breathed in silence. January 30th, 1945. After nearly 3 years of captivity, liberation was coming, quietly, precisely, invisibly. From the west, 121 U.S. Rangers moved through the grass. From the east, Filipino guerrillas waited by the Kabu River. Their mission, free more than 500 prisoners before the Japanese could execute them. By then, retreat orders had turned the Japanese army desperate. They had begun killing prisoners in other camps. Palawan, Davao, entire groups burned alive. At Cabanatuan, the guards were preparing to march the captives north. Most would not survive. According to U.S. Army Ranger reports, the rescue plan was a miracle of timing and faith. The Rangers crawled more than a mile across open fields under the eyes of sentries. Every movement synced to the hum of a passing P-61 Black Widow, flying low to mask their noise. Inside the camp, the prisoners didn't know. They were too weak, too hollow to dream of escape. Many had stopped speaking altogether, and then gunfire, short bursts, then shouting, then the impossible sound of American voices in the dark. One survivor recalled, I thought it was another drill. Then I saw the stars on their shoulders, and I knew. For a few minutes, chaos returned. Guards running, men stumbling toward the gates, Filipino guerrillas firing from the tree line, the air thick with smoke and disbelief. The prisoners were so frail they could barely walk. So, Rangers carried them, 2 at a time, through the mud. Some refused to go until others were lifted first. Even in freedom, the old rule held, the weakest first. A Japanese machine gun opened from the north tower. A Ranger lieutenant took the shot meant for his men. He fell, but the column never stopped moving. By dawn, the rescue was complete. All 511 prisoners freed. 2 Rangers and several Filipino scouts killed, the cost of one of the most precise operations in the Pacific War. The 5th discovery unfolded not in the battle, but in what followed. As the trucks rolled south, survivors began handing out their rations to the villagers who had risked their lives guiding them through the night. Even after years of starvation, they still shared their food. The instinct had survived the camps. A Japanese sergeant captured days later was asked what he thought of the rescue. He replied softly, "They did not escape. They were carried by their friends. That is stronger than any army." The scene at the airstrip that morning was unlike anything else in the war. Men weighing barely 100 pounds saluting their rescuers. tears cutting clean lines through the dust on their faces. A photographer from Life magazine later wrote, "They had nothing left but each other, and that was enough." For the Japanese soldiers who witnessed it, the moment marked the collapse of an old belief that honor lived only in brutal victory. Here, honor had lived in survival, in loyalty, in mercy. As the sun rose over the plains of Luzon, the last trucks vanished into the haze. Behind them, the camp stood empty, silent except for the wind through the broken fence. February 1945. Manila lay in ruins. Columns of smoke drifted across the Pasig River. The empire that once believed mercy was weakness was now collapsing in silence. The men from Cabanatuan returned home slowly, thin, quiet, unrecognizable. Some weighed less than their packs. Others carried malaria and scars that would never heal. But inside them was something the war could not take. According to Library of Congress oral histories, when former prisoners spoke of those years, they rarely mentioned their guards first. They spoke of each other, of the man who split his rice, of the medic who gave his last quinine tablet, of the stranger who whispered, "Hold on, one more night." In Tokyo, Allied prosecutors examined Japanese command culture. The Bushido ideal, twisted by militarism, had become both engine and cage. Discipline without compassion had led to atrocities without purpose. Even some Japanese veterans admitted it. One guard testified, "I learned too late that kindness can also be strength." That realization became one of the quiet outcomes of the Pacific War, a moral reconstruction that began not in Tokyo's courtrooms, but in its silences. The American prisoners, once nameless survivors, became witnesses. Their accounts formed part of the post-war humanitarian codes. The Geneva Revisions of 1949 that redefined how nations must treat captives. The legacy of that march in those camps became law. But beneath the legal texts lay a deeper inheritance. That endurance is not built by cruelty. That courage, divided among the weak, multiplies. For the men who endured Bataan and Cabanatuan, freedom was never a celebration. It was an echo of footsteps on a burning road, of hands passing food from one to another, of voices saying nothing, but meaning everything. Archival photos show them years later, standing at reunions, arms around each other. Old men now, but the same look in their eyes, not pride, recognition. One survivor said simply, "We shared our food because it was all we had, and because it was all that mattered." That truth outlasted empires. It crossed oceans and decades. It lived on in the soldiers who returned to rebuild, and in the Japanese who stayed to learn what had gone wrong. Compassion had survived where power failed, and in that survival, a new kind of strength was born, one that no army could command and no war could destroy. The Philippines, 1945. The rain fell again, soft, endless, over graves, over roads, over names fading into the earth. And for the first time in years, the guards, the prisoners, and the land itself were quiet.